You know, people think that when you get old, you become afraid of death. But that's not true. Old people don't fear the end. What we fear is an unfinished story. I spent my life in medicine, saved thousands of patients, comforted hundreds more. I watched last breaths, first breaths, breaths struggling to hold on. I thought I had seen every shape a human life could take, but only one person ever came back to save me. And that's where this story begins, with a strange, impossible truth that didn't scare me, but softened something inside me. I guess that's what happens when you've lived long enough. Fear becomes a familiar guest, and mystery becomes strangely comforting. This story isn't supernatural, not magic, not ghosts. It's human, painfully, beautifully human. And yet, it still haunts me in the gentlest way, like someone tapping lightly on the door of my memory, reminding me of something I'd forgotten to remember. You see, before I was this wrinkled man who walks too slowly and wakes too early, I used to be someone else, someone younger, sharper, a man who believed science held every answer. If only you look closely enough, I wasn't born into privilege. I came from a working-class street where dreams were luxuries few could afford. My father worked 2 jobs. My mother prayed we'd survive each month without losing our home. Medical school wasn't a promise. It was a miracle I chased with bleeding fingers and sleepless nights. The first day I put on that white coat, it felt like touching heaven with the very tip of one finger. Just enough to know it was real, not enough to reach it entirely. I was young, ambitious, terrified, and hopeful. Back then, the world felt large, endlessly complicated, yet somehow conquerable. Funny thing is, knowledge fades. You forget drug names, surgical techniques, protocols that once lived on your tongue like second nature. But kindness never leaves. It sits quietly somewhere in the attic of your mind, waiting for the right moment to whisper, "Remember who you were." I didn't know it at the time, but one small kindness I gave, one moment so insignificant I barely noticed it, would return to me after decades, return not as a memory, but as a man whose face I should have forgotten, a man who carried my kindness like a lantern through his entire life and brought it back to me when mine felt dimmest. Even now, retelling it, my voice shakes. Not from fear, but from gratitude mixed with something I can't quite name, something tender. This story, it changed everything I understood about medicine, about people, about what it truly means to save a life. And it begins with the version of me I barely remember anymore. The young doctor who thought every problem had a diagnosis, and every diagnosis had a cure. By the time retirement found me, and yes, retirement finds you, you never really choose it. I had grown softer around the edges. My joints had stiffened like old hinges. My memory, well, let's just say it had become a polite but unreliable friend. The world rushed forward while I slowed down, and sometimes I felt like a man standing on a station platform, watching trains he used to ride. But mornings remained gentle. A cup of warm tea, the creak of the porch chair, the early sun crawling across quiet streets. In those hours, I didn't feel useless. I felt present, still part of something. Yet even in retirement, the ache of wanting to matter never really left me. So I found a small way to feel useful again. Volunteering at the hospital archives, nothing dramatic, no emergencies, no rushing down hallways in clattering shoes, just shelves of old paper files, the soft scent of dust and time, and a room full of stories no one read anymore. Records of lives once fragile, once urgent, now silent. Something about that work felt right, like returning to the roots of my purpose without the weight of saving anyone. Most days were quiet. I knew which shelves squeaked, which folders sagged, which drawers stuck. It was familiar, predictable, almost meditative until one rainy morning. The kind of morning where the sky looks bruised and the world smells like wet concrete. I arrived early, shaking off my umbrella, humming some tune I can't remember. Now I made my way to Section C, the older files, patient histories dating back over 50 years. My job was simple: reorganize them by decade and classification. But that morning, something was wrong. One file sat out of place. Not just misplaced, completely unmistakably wrong. Wrong color, wrong shelf, wrong year. A faded green folder where only beige ones should be. I almost ignored it. Retirement makes you lazy that way. But some tightness behind my ribs, made me pull it out. The label read, Daniel Hale, room 214. I felt it immediately, a pull, a quiet heaviness, like stepping onto a memory you don't remember making. When I opened the folder, it was empty. No medical charts, no notes, just a single worn photograph tucked at the bottom. A man in his 30s, perhaps, tired smile, eyes that held hope in one hand and pain in the other, eyes that looked at me like they knew me. My breath caught, the kind that doesn't fully leave your chest. I recognized those eyes, but not the man. And that was the moment. The moment something in my heart moved before my mind could keep up. An unfinished story had just tapped me on the shoulder. I held the photograph as if it might crumble under my fingers. Not because it looked fragile, but because I suddenly felt fragile. The man in the picture stood against a plain hospital wall, one hand tucked into the pocket of an old coat. His smile, it wasn't wide or cheerful. It was the kind of smile people manage when life has worn them down. Yet somehow they still find the strength to lift the corners of their mouth. A tired smile, but honest. And his eyes, Lord, those eyes, they held a kind of quiet longing I recognized far too well. Like he was grateful someone had bothered to look at him at all. I had seen that look countless times in hospital corridors. People who weren't just sick in the body, but sick in the soul. I turned the photograph over carefully. A date was written in faint blue ink, 1968. That made no sense. In 1968, I wasn't even in medical school yet. I was just a young man studying harder than he breathed, trying to earn his place at the table. How could a photograph from a time before my career hold a face my heart recognized? I said it out loud, softly, foolishly. How can my heart know someone my mind doesn't? Before I could make sense of the feeling, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Slow, steady, unhurried, not the quick, confident steps of a nurse, not the heavy stomp of an orderly, not the tapping walk of a doctor on rounds. These were softer, measured, as if the person walking carried time differently, as if they were in no rush to meet the moment waiting for them. I turned, partly curious, partly uneasy. And when I looked up, my breath simply left me. A man stood at the arch of the doorway, older now, hair gray, shoulders curved with years, but unmistakable. It was him, the same man from the photograph. He didn't look confused or nervous. He didn't even hesitate. He looked at me as though he had been walking toward this exact moment for decades. And with the calmness of someone greeting an old friend, he said, "It's been a long time, doctor." My mouth went dry. My hands felt too warm, too cold. Everything all at once, because in that moment, without knowing how or why, I understood something quietly terrifying. My story hadn't ended with retirement. Something from long before, from a time I barely remembered, had finally come back to find me, and it had walked straight out of an impossible photograph into my present. He stepped closer, not hurried, not dramatic, just a quiet, steady walk, the way someone approaches a person they've known for years. I watched him lower himself into the chair across from me, hands folded neatly, posture humble yet intentional, as if he didn't want to intrude, but also knew he belonged in that moment. "Daniel," I whispered, reading the name from the file. It felt strange saying it aloud, like speaking the name of a stranger whose presence felt uncomfortably familiar. He smiled gently. "You won't remember me," he said. "Not fully, not clearly, but I remember you." My mind was a cluttered attic. Dusty memories, half-lost moments, shadows that had no shape. I'd lived through thousands of patients, thousands of brief encounters. There's a strange truth in medicine. You remember faces, but not stories, suffering, but not names. So I searched myself for anything that resembled recognition, but all I found was a ripple, like when a stone hits old water. I looked at him again. He was older, yes, but his presence had weight, a softness I couldn't explain. "How do we know each other?" I asked, embarrassed by my own uncertainty. "You weren't my doctor," Daniel said, his voice as calm as a late afternoon. "Just a trainee, a boy, really. You walked into the wrong room." His words stirred something deep in my chest, a flicker of a forgotten scene, maybe real, maybe imagined. "You didn't ask many questions," he continued. "You just stood there, unsure of yourself, hair too long, coat too big, hands shaking from nerves I could tell you didn't fit yet, but you wanted to." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. It felt like someone brushed dust off an old photograph buried in my own mind. Daniel leaned back slightly. "You thought you'd interrupted me," he said, "and you asked, very awkwardly I might add, 'Are you all right, sir?' That line, that exact phrasing, hit something in me. A memory cracked open, faint and blurred, but undeniably mine. I remembered a young version of myself, terrified of making mistakes, terrified of being in the way, stepping into a dim hospital room. I remembered a man sitting alone, looking older than his years, staring at a window that showed nothing but rain. And I remembered saying those words, "Are you all right, sir?" It had been a moment so small I never carried it with me. Yet here was a man who had held it for half a century. Daniel's smile softened. "You were the only one who saw me," he said quietly. "You didn't rush, you didn't judge, you just noticed." And sometimes noticing someone is the kindest form of medicine. A warmth spread in my chest, confusion mixed with humility. What was, for me, a forgettable moment, had been for him a turning point. For the first time in a very long while, I felt myself age backwards, back into the skin of the young man I used to be. Daniel took a slow breath, the kind people take when they're about to open doors they've kept shut for half a lifetime. "I wasn't admitted just once," he said quietly. "That's probably why the memory feels scattered for you." He looked down at his hands, steady, folded, patient. "I came here 3 times over the years, 3 chapters of a life that wasn't going very well." I leaned forward without meaning to. There was something about his tone, gentle but weighted, that made my old heart ache. "Tell me," I said. He nodded, not dramatically, just gratefully, like he'd waited decades for someone to ask that simple word. 1968, he began. I was young. I had no one, no real future. I wasn't sick, not physically, just exhausted, empty. He chuckled softly. Doctors back then didn't know what to do with a patient who was lonely. I felt my throat tighten. Loneliness is a disease medicine still struggle to diagnose. "They sent me home after 2 days," Daniel continued. "No prescriptions, just instructions to rest." He shook his head. "You can't rest from emptiness." He looked at me, his eyes shining with something like distant grief. The second time was 1971. I collapsed at work, not from illness, just overwork and not enough food in my stomach. He tapped his chest once. "Stress is a silent bruise, doctor. No one sees it until it breaks something." I nodded, feeling that familiar ache of knowing how many cases slip through the cracks because their wounds don't show up on a scan. Then came 1982, he said, and his voice softened into something fragile. My wife had died that year. She was the only person who ever waited for me at home. He paused, swallowing. "A heart doesn't break cleanly, you know. It fractures in quiet places." I closed my eyes for a moment. I'd seen that grief too many times in hospital rooms. People who didn't know how to keep living after the person they loved stopped. "I didn't need medicine," Daniel whispered. "I needed someone to see that I was human, that I mattered." He looked at me again, really looked, and his expression warmed into something tender. "You did that," he said. "Back when you were just a scared trainee. You stepped into my room and asked a question no one had asked me in years." He paused, repeating it. "Are you all right, sir?" It was such a small thing, a fragment of kindness, barely a minute of my young life. Yet Daniel continued, voice trembling just slightly. "That moment stayed with me for 50 years. 5 minutes of being seen kept me alive for 5 decades." Those words settled into the deepest part of me, a place I didn't even know was empty. I felt my eyes sting, not with regret, but with the sudden realization of how deeply unnoticed kindness can change a life. Not with grand gestures, not with brilliance, but with presence. In that moment, I understood something I'd forgotten over the years. Medicine saves bodies. Attention saves souls. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some truths demand silence first. The kind of silence that lets your heart catch up to what your ears just heard. Daniel sat there like an old friend I somehow remembered but couldn't place. And strangely, it didn't feel awkward. It felt natural, comfortable even. He glanced around the archive room, the shelves lined with decades of forgotten lives. Then he said, "You know, I followed your career, quietly." That startled me. "You followed me?" I asked, feeling both humbled and confused. He nodded with a small smile. "You worked hard, doctor. You searched for truths in science, in the body, in the invisible places between illness and healing." He paused, tapping a finger lightly on the file. "And I searched for people who cared." It wasn't a compliment. It was a mirror, a gentle, painful one. He continued, "Every article you wrote, every lecture, I read them. Not because I understood all the science," he chuckled, "but because it reminded me that somewhere out there, a man who once noticed me was trying to notice the whole world." Something warmed in my chest, something deep and old and unexpected. For the first time in years, I felt valued, not for my skill, not for my knowledge, but for a humanity I had forgotten I possessed. We talked like that for what felt like hours, not as doctor and patient, not even as acquaintances, but as two aging men comparing the weight of their pasts. I found myself asking questions I hadn't asked anyone in years. Where have you been all this time? Why now? How did you find me? He didn't answer the way a scientist would. He answered like someone who had lived more years inside his heart than in the world. Some thank yous, he said softly, ripen slowly. That line hit me harder than any medical truth I'd ever learned, because it was real, profoundly, achingly real. He looked around the room again, as though visiting a home he once lived in. His eyes stopped on a windowsill, where dust had settled like powdered time. This place, he murmured, held me once, not physically, but emotionally. He turned back to me. You were young then. You didn't know your own strength. He tapped his chest. But I did, because I needed it. His words hummed like a warm echo through the still room. For the first time in my long scientific life, I had no diagnosis, no explanation, no neat little box to place this encounter in. This man, this soft-spoken stranger from an old photograph, had returned not for closure, not for answers, but simply to deliver a thank you that had taken 50 years to find its way back. And even then, even as the gratitude hung between us like a gentle lantern, I felt a stirring suspicion deep in my bones. There was more to this meeting, something unsaid, something unfinished, a question I hadn't yet asked, and an answer he hadn't yet offered. Daniel stood up slowly, the way older men do, not out of weakness, but out of respect for the moment they're leaving behind. He rested a hand briefly on the back of the chair, steadying himself, then looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen in years, a softness I didn't realize I desperately needed. I should go, he said gently. His voice carried the weight of a farewell that had waited half a century. I stood too, instinctively. Daniel, why now? I asked. It wasn't a scientific question, it was a human one. The kind you ask when your heart senses a truth your mind can't grasp yet. He smiled the kind of smile only people who've made peace with their past can give. You healed more people than you know, he said. You healed me before you even became anyone. The words hit me like a warm ache spreading through my ribs. Years of doubt, regret, faded pride, all of it softened under the weight of what he said next. You spent your life patching bodies, but one day you'll realize the best thing you ever fixed was something you didn't even know was broken. He reached for my arm and squeezed gently, the way a father might steady a son. Take care of yourself now, doctor. You've spent enough years taking care of everyone else. Then he turned toward the hallway. His steps were slow, steady, unhurried, just as they'd been when he entered. But this time, each step felt heavier, like he was walking out of my life as quietly as he had walked into it. For a moment, I simply watched him. Watched the way the fluorescent lights flickered across his shoulders. Watched the way his silhouette shrank down the long corridor. Something in me cracked open. A memory, a feeling, a truth I hadn't named yet. And before I realized it, I was walking after him, not running. No old man runs without regretting it, but moving quickly enough that my joints protested. Daniel, I called softly. My voice echoed off the walls. He didn't turn. When I reached the hallway, he was gone, not around the corner. Not down the elevator, not at the stairs, just gone. I checked the branching corridors, empty. I checked the nearby rooms, quiet. I checked the visitor sign-in sheet at the desk. No Daniel Hale, no signature, no entry log, nothing. The security guard shook his head. No one came through here in the last hour. But I was sitting with him, I insisted. He was right there in the archives. She gave me the kind of sympathetic smile people reserve for the very old. Maybe you were remembering someone, she said softly, but I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt, what I'd heard. This wasn't memory. This wasn't imagination. Daniel had been there, real enough to leave warmth on the chair he sat in, and heavy enough to leave me shaken. And yet the hospital, the building I'd served for decades, held no trace of him, as if he had walked out of time itself and into my life just long enough to finish a story. I returned to the archive room in a daze, as if the walls themselves might whisper an explanation. The chair he sat on was still slightly angled toward mine, a tiny human detail that made everything feel even more impossible. The green folder still lay open on the desk. The photograph, his photograph, still rested inside. I picked it up again, holding it by the edges, as though touching too much might erase something precious. My eyes scanned every detail I had missed before. The faint crease near the top corner, the smudged fingerprint near the edge. The tired smile that now felt even more familiar. I turned it over. And for a moment, my breath simply stopped. There at the bottom of the photograph, beneath the faded date 1968, was a signature, my signature, written in my old youthful handwriting, the kind I hadn't used in decades before medical school forced my pen into rushed scrawls and clinical abbreviations. The R curved exactly the way I used to make it when I was barely 20. The tail of the S dipped slightly left, a habit I'd abandoned long ago. It was me, undeniably me, 40, maybe 50 years ago, but I had no memory of signing it, no recollection of writing on any photograph. I wasn't even a doctor in 1968. I was still a boy with too large dreams and too small confidence. The room felt colder, smaller, like it had curled inward, protecting a secret I wasn't meant to uncover. How do you hold evidence of a memory you do not remember making? I sat down. My knees didn't trust me anymore. I tried to anchor myself in logic, the old familiar comfort of science. Perhaps the file got mislabeled, or the photo was placed by accident, or maybe someone was playing a cruel joke. But even as the thoughts formed, I rejected them. Not stubbornly, but instinctively, because I knew, not through fact, but through something deeper, that Daniel's visit was not a trick, not madness, not confusion. It was truth delivered gently, in a form I could accept. And yet, there was still one question gnawing at the edges of my heart. Why did he come back now? Why wait 5 decades to return a kindness I barely remembered giving? As those questions tightened in my mind, a strange feeling rose in my chest, a mixture of sadness and clarity, because suddenly, painfully, I understood something about myself, something I had avoided for years. I had lived a life healing bodies, brilliantly at times, desperately at others. But in my chase for knowledge, I had forgotten the simplest truth. Healing begins with seeing, listening, being present. I had lost that over the years, buried beneath procedures, paperwork, time, pride, exhaustion. Daniel had come back not to confuse me, not to thank me, but to return something I had lost somewhere along the way. Humanity, gentleness, purpose, the very things that make medicine more than science. The next morning, long before the volunteers or nurses arrived, I walked the hospital halls alone. Old habit, I suppose. The feet remember what the heart has forgotten. The fluorescent lights flickered in that familiar, rhythmic hum. The air smelled like antiseptic. In quiet hopes, I moved slowly, one hand grazing the walls, like a man tracing memories with his fingertips. I found myself drifting toward the older wings, the ones most staff avoided unless they had to be there. The walls were yellowed with age, the tiles cracked in places, but to me, these halls were sacred. This was where I had learned how to be human, long before I learned how to be a doctor. I stopped outside room 214. The number hung slightly crooked, as if time had nudged it gently over the years. I stood at the doorway for a long moment, letting the silence settle around me. Room 214, the place where a scared young trainee once asked an exhausted man if he was all right. A small question, a small kindness, a moment I had thrown away, and a moment Daniel had carried with him for the rest of his life. I stepped inside. The room was empty now, just a simple cot in an old window framed by peeling paint. But the air felt warm, as if memories lived in the corners, like dust that refused to be swept away. I sat down on the edge of the bed, letting the weight of years rest on my shoulders. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt the deep, steady pull of purpose return. Soft, like a weathered heart finding its rhythm again. When a nurse passed by, she paused at the door and gave me a curious look. "Doctor, you all right?" Funny how history repeats itself. I smiled. "Yes," I said, "just remembering." She nodded politely and moved on, but her brief pause made something shift inside me. Maybe that's all healing really is, pausing long enough to see someone. Later that day, I spoke to some of the younger staff. Bright faces, fast steps, eyes full of science, but not yet softened by loss. I didn't lecture them about technique or efficiency or the mechanics of diagnosis. Instead, I told them a story. Not Daniel's story in full, that felt too sacred. But I told them this. Patients aren't just cases. Sometimes they come here with empty hearts that need filling more than their charts need updating. Listen to them. Notice them. That's medicine too. Some nodded. Some smiled. Some didn't understand yet. But one day, they will. As I walked home that evening, the sun low against the sky, I realized something profound. Daniel's visit wasn't meant to give me answers. It was meant to remind me of a truth I had misplaced somewhere along the years. Tiny kindness matters, deeply, endlessly, quietly. And then, almost as if speaking directly to the listener, to you, I thought, don't underestimate your small moments. You never know whose lifetime you're changing. I reached home that evening with a feeling I hadn't carried in years. A sense of peaceful ache, the kind that comes when a truth finally settles after a long journey. I sat by the window, watched the sky shift from gold to a deep evening blue, and allowed myself to simply breathe. Daniel's visit, his gratitude, his disappearance, it all swirled in my mind like a soft storm. Not frightening, not confusing, just full. Full of meaning I hadn't realized I still needed. You know, when you spend decades treating illness, you grow accustomed to beginnings and endings, birth and loss, hope and grief. You start to believe life is made of these big, dramatic moments. The ones that feel important, decisive, final. But maybe life is held together by the small ones, the brief glances, the gentle questions, the simple kindnesses that never make it into medical journals or academic discussions or hospital reports. Maybe healing happens most in the quiet moments no one remembers, except the person who needed them. I thought back to the young trainee I once was. Awkward, unsure, barely brave enough to knock on a patient's door. He didn't know much, that boy. Didn't know how to read EKGs or perform complex procedures or make life-altering decisions. But he knew how to notice someone. He knew how to ask, "Are you all right, sir?" with sincerity, somewhere along the winding road of life, burdened by responsibility, reshaped by loss, tempered by age. I had misplaced that part of myself, not lost forever, just forgotten in the noise of years. And maybe Daniel didn't come back to thank me. Maybe he came back to return something I had given him, a kindness, so I could remember how to offer it again, because kindness, once given, doesn't disappear. It travels, it grows, it ripens, as he said. And sometimes it finds its way back when you need it most. As the last of the daylight slipped away, I felt a calm settle in my bones. A warmth that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with understanding. I whispered a quiet truth into the empty room, not for anyone else, but for myself. I heal differently now, not with medicine, but with stories, with listening, with presence. I realized then that retirement hadn't ended my purpose. It had simply changed its shape. And that's all right. Life, after all, is about adapting to the seasons of our heart. Before I closed the curtains for the night, I spoke one final thought. Maybe to the world, maybe to Daniel, maybe to anyone who has ever felt forgotten. And if one day someone remembers you, let it be for a kindness you forgot you gave. And with that, the story finally felt complete. Not finished out of necessity, but complete out of peace. A soft ending to a long human story.